Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the E-Institute's webinar series. We offer a free monthly webinar series that discusses cutting-edge issues in development. Experts from the World Bank Group and our partners share the latest approach on topics such as jobs, social entrepreneurships, green growth, climate smart agriculture, and so on through online presentations and real time discussions. The goal of the webinar series is to educate and foster discussion around pressing issues in development. These are targeted largely towards policymakers and practitioners, although everyone is welcome to attend. Today we have a very interesting agenda planned. We have with us Dr. Douglas White. He will discuss strategic planning for climate smart agriculture. How can we assess synergies and trade off? Dr. White's presentation will help you develop a better understanding of economic and social synergies and trade offs between adaptation, mitigation, and food security, and it will provide insights into integrated models and decision support tools for national decision makers in order to help prioritize agricultural action. Let me tell you a little bit about the speaker. Dr. Douglas White is an expert in international conservation and development and is a scientist and consultant at Research for Development and Conservation, where he supports initiatives on national RED policy analysis, climate change, climate smart agriculture, and impact assessment of improved agricultural crops. Before his current position, Dr. White was a senior scientist at the International Center for Tropical Agriculture in Peru and Colombia and has had extensive work experience with government and non-governmental agencies in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe. So without much ado, I hand over the mic to Dr. Douglas White.
Okay, here we show how to get ready for worsening weather while growing local solutions for a better global climate. The presentation is in two parts. First, we include a preface on the role of agriculture in climate change, and then introduce a landscapes approach with discussion on how it helps achieve CSA at scales needed to substantially reduce agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. Second, since many people are needed to advance the process of CSA, ranging from farmers to bankers to policymakers, we show how a landscapes approach identifies their needs and priorities, along with the likely consequences, so that new initiatives can replace long-standing obstacles. The landscapes approach serves as a guide to identify and coordinate an optimal course of action, which includes prioritizing investments, creating incentives, making agreements, and fostering actions that are essential in making agriculture climate smart. Part 1. Why is a landscapes approach best? Here we give a rationale for seeing things differently. But before we do this, let's discuss the potential role of agriculture in reducing climate change. We next summarize what is CSA, its goals and objectives, since CSA can mean different things to different people. A better understanding of CSA is essential before moving forward with strategic planning. We then introduce a landscapes approach and why the plural and not the singular of landscape is used. And then we discuss some of the advantages of the landscape approach in advancing CSA. Agriculture has an important role to play in mitigating climate change for two reasons. It is a substantial cause of climate change, and it is one of the more cost-effective ways of reducing it. First, the causes. Agriculture is responsible for almost half of all human-related nitrous oxide emissions. Furthermore, by 2030, annual methane and nitrous oxide emissions are projected to worsen, particularly in developing countries. The causes are many. Analysis of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, estimated that agricultural practices in 2004 contributed to approximately 14% of all emissions. When also considering how agriculture causes deforestation, emissions contribute to 1/4 of all emissions. Major sources of agricultural emissions are nitrous oxide from fertilizer use, methane from cattle, rice paddies, and manure, carbon dioxide from burning of crop residues. Surprisingly, commercial logging causes less than 20% of deforestation, whereas expansion of crop and cattle production are major causes of emissions. Also, if the entire food chain were considered, overall emissions would be even higher, since some emission sources are reported under transport, energy, and industry sectors. Nevertheless, agriculture is expected to be an important cure for climate change and make up for more than it causes. Improved agriculture is expected to provide 18% of all expected emissions reductions. Together with better forest management, agriculture can provide up to 1/3 of all emissions reductions. So how is agriculture expected to do more than its share of reducing emissions? According to the IPCC, most of Asia, the Americas, and Africa have relatively high levels of emissions, due in part to the large land areas. But by changing agricultural practices, and sometimes the products from land, climate-smart agriculture enables the agricultural sector to make substantial contributions to mitigating climate change, while also benefiting rural communities. Nevertheless, achieving large-scale changes in agriculture is no easy task, and strategic planning helps to identify the best course of action. What is the best course of action for climate-smart agriculture? First, we need to know what is climate-smart agriculture, or CSA, its goals and objectives. CSA does a number of things. According to the World Bank, it increases agricultural harvests, thereby helping to reduce poverty and improve food security. It also makes yields more resilient in the face of worsening weather conditions, thus adapting the agriculture to climate change. And third, it transforms the farm into a solution to the climate change problem. In other words, helping to mitigate climate change. So CSA is a multi-objective goal, with objectives being complementary and others potentially clashing. CSA is also a process involving different types of people, such as remote smallholder farmers, national and international policymakers, international investors, and financiers. Therefore, CSA is a negotiated effort. The many participants have different objectives, or at least priorities, from increasing farm incomes, improving rural welfare, making good returns on investments, and improving climate. Achieving substantial reductions will require numerous agreements and changes, accomplished over many years. Whose voice will be the loudest? Will the outcomes be fair? Is avoiding emissions a more cost-effective way than capturing carbon? All these issues and others are important to understand when advancing a strategic plan. To help guide us through a process of identifying, analyzing, and prioritizing the best course of action, we use a landscapes approach. But first, let's discuss what is a landscape. According to the European Landscape Convention of 2000, a landscape is an area as perceived by people whose character is a result of the action and interaction of natural and or human factors. Landscapes are not a specific area, but instead areas with similar functions. Knowing these functions are how we identify challenges and how to develop solutions to achieve CSA. The multiple functions of a landscape include economic functions, as in the activities of land such as farming, ranching, logging, and mining. The functions are also environmental, providing water, wildlife, soil fertility, clean air, and carbon storage. Landscapes also have social functions reflecting cultural traditions, market arrangements, and government policies. So landscapes are more than meets the eye. Their size and scale depends on the functions and interactions. For agriculture in general, and specifically CSA, these functions, although many, typically occur at an in-between geographic mesoscale, not macrocontinents, nor micros such as fields or stands of trees, but a landscape can be seen as a basin, a valley, or a water catchment. From an economic perspective, they can be seen as a regional market area or a local harvest area. From a government administration perspective, it can often follow borders such as states or departments or counties and districts. And from a cultural perspective, it often follows different communities with similar ethnicities or traditions. So landscapes can be considered in between greater landscapes of approximately 1 million hectares to smaller landscapes that are greater than 100 hectares in size. What do landscapes imply for climate smart agriculture? A landscape is an area of land of interrelated social traditions, economic activities, and environmental services that new policies and investments can change. For most countries in the process of planning climate smart agriculture, numerous landscapes will exist within their borders. A landscapes approach helps CSA identify different functions and potentials. For example, by thinking of agriculture with natural resources such as air and climate, soils and water, biodiversity, and forests. By thinking of agriculture with policies and traditions, recognizing the roles of livelihood customs, laws and regulations, organizations, and participation in policy processes. And by thinking of agriculture with technology and markets, a landscapes approach takes into account the roles of improved crops, animals and trees, new and more products for home and market sale, and economic mechanisms such as credit for investments and insurance to reduce financial risks. Why a landscapes approach? Well, the traditional economic sector approaches do not recognize interactions between agriculture, forestry, and other sectors of the economy. A landscape approach helps to understand who participates in CSA and how they may be affected, both positively and negatively. And it identifies essential efforts required to achieve substantial changes in agricultural practices, and provides a way to scale up project-based initiatives in a coordinated national program. How a landscape approach can work. Landscape approach to CSA is based on better management of soils by rotating crops, prudently using fertilizers, incorporating trees and ground covers into farm management practices, or establishing woodlots and water storage structures. Or through such efforts, levels of carbon and biodiversity can increase. However, such accomplishments require investments, incentives, and actions. A landscapes approach helps to identify what training and policy changes are needed. such as building capacities in crop, soil, forest, and water management, community organization and negotiation skills, improved legal frameworks. All these are a process of training which can empower rural communities to effectively engage in CSA policy processes. A landscapes approach also helps to identify better technologies in new markets. For example, research and extension can improve the performance of crops and animals and soils and water and trees. Market intelligence connects sellers with buyers. Effective mechanisms and agreements can compensate providers of environmental services. Financial mechanisms can provide startup funds and feasible ways to make investments. In sum, a landscapes approach helps to identify the processes of change needed, such as policies and traditions, technologies and markets, so that better natural resources management becomes viable and in the best interest of local and global communities. But why processes of change? With change, rarely does everyone agree and benefit equally. This challenge brings up the next section, how to address different needs and priorities with strategic planning. Part 2. Here we talk about the analytical tools for strategic planning and the five key steps of a strategic plan: envisioning, a review, identification, planning, and re-examining the process. Also, we discuss performance criteria of the landscapes approach. Then we'll talk about synergies and trade-offs within CSA, what they are, why their analysis is important, and we'll finish up with tools used to plan out CSA landscapes. Step 1, envision. What are the desired conditions of the landscapes? This step is about identifying the landscapes and their potentials. Although CSA has three basic objectives, achieving these objectives requires attention to larger scope challenges of social equity, economic growth, and environmental sustainability. These three thematic landscapes serve as a framework to guide CSA planning and evaluate performance. Step 2, review the context of the landscapes. This includes diagnosing the current situation and determining the gaps between actual and potential performance and why there's a difference. To accomplish this, an evaluation framework is needed with performance criteria for social equity, economic growth, and environmental stability. Diagnosis of these landscapes helps understand key obstacles and challenges. CSA is based on well-performing traditions and policies. For example, a context of fair opportunity requires clear resource rights, along with an effectively functioning legal system, be it national or traditional system. Poverty is not determined just by $2 a day income, but refers to issues of capabilities and empowerment. CSA has the potential to foster participation across many sectors of society in order for them to share their perspectives and influence policy processes in both local organizations and governing organizations. However, as CSA changes agricultural practices, livelihood traditions might be at risk. Social safeguards such as free, informed, and prior consent is essential before advancing CSA. For the criterion of economic growth, both technologies and markets need to perform well. Economic growth can be generated by enhanced provision of products and services, including off-farm environmental services such as improved carbon storage and water flows. Also, investments in inputs and post-harvest processes can enable agriculture to participate in new markets and generate additional investments. Identification of constraints to technology improvement is crucial along the entire value chain, from inputs, production, transportation, and marketing. With well-performing technologies and markets, along with traditions and policies, the enabling conditions are in place to improve environmental sustainability. With investments instead of degradation and better incentives and management, a wide range of environmental services can improve. Step 3. Identify the actions. What actions must be taken to close the gaps? Also, what policies and conditions are essential for CSA? Achieving changes in agriculture requires changes in incentives, investments, and practices. Example CSA practices include increasing soil carbon storage with improved crop and grazeland management, restoration of soils and degraded lands, also reducing methane emissions, reducing nitrous emissions, or replacing fossil fuel use. These practices require stimulus. To foster investments, incentives and regulations can include payments for environmental services, grants or loans with rotating credit arrangements, fiscal measures such as tax and tariff reductions for performance, insurance against harvest losses, and certification to obtain premium product prices. Fourth, requires coordination of a plan. What are the resources required to implement activities? And what are the roles and responsibilities of participating organizations? Numerous organizations can advance and influence CSA directly and indirectly. Organizations can be public, such as governmental administrations, ministries, and agencies, and private, with non-governmental organizations, community-based or civil society organizations, private industry, and citizens. CSA policies and projects must be shared, reviewed, and even co-developed by such stakeholders in order to avoid conflicting or duplicated efforts. Step 5 is to address the potential complexities inherent with CSA. With many actors and actions involved, unexpected surprises are likely, which could greatly affect preconceived plans. This step calls for re-examining probable outcomes resulting from new incentives and investments. A useful way to examine CSA is to consider synergies and trade-offs. CSA initiatives can generate substantial changes. Not all are simple cause and effect relationships. Two types of effects, synergies and trade-offs, are often discussed. Nevertheless, synergies and trade-offs are not opposing concepts. Let's take a closer look at these. A synergy is an interaction of two or more activities so that their combined impact is greater than the sum of their individual effects. For example, a combination of better soils, water, and new crop varieties can produce greater gains than any separate component. In contrast, a trade-off is an outcome where not all the objectives are attainable at the same time, and a gain towards one objective comes with loss of another. A common way to describe a trade-off is a win-lose situation or a zero-sum game. Establishing trees on the wealthy lands is an example of an economic and environmental benefit, but comes with a social trade-off of marginalizing less wealthy citizens. The opposite effect of a trade-off is a co-benefit. Here, additional objectives are attainable at the same time without extra effort. A co-benefit is a win-win outcome. With carbon programs, both biodiversity and water provision are commonly mentioned as co-benefits. The opposite of a synergy is perhaps the biggest problem in attempting to achieve sustained change, overlooking a constraint or obstacle. A classic example of successful introduction of new crop varieties or fertilizers that greatly increase yields. Yet undeveloped market channels can cause prices to dramatically fall, with farmers losing in the end. Identifying such overlooked necessary conditions is a major objective of a landscapes approach. This analytical framework can help planners to critically review proposed CSA efforts across a range of landscapes. Let's discuss some more specific examples with regard to the IPCC suggestions on how to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Both co-benefits and trade-offs commonly arise. This table summarizes various initiatives such as better management of crops, grazing management, degraded lands, manure, and bioenergy. All these mitigation efforts have both positive and uncertain contributions to climate change. For example, with cropland management, specific practices can have beneficial impacts on one emission source while having uncertain or possibly negative effects on the other. Avoiding wetland drainage, for example, can reduce CO2 emissions but increase methane releases and have indeterminate nitrous emissions, and is an example of a trade-off. An example of a co-benefit is the improved feeding of animals whereby both methane and nitrous emissions decrease. Trade-offs and co-benefits are also common when considering other environmental objectives, such as the effects of CSA activities on soil and water. Effects can be positive or uncertain. For example, with nutrient management, a synergy is likely to exist between mitigation co-benefits and improvement to soils and water resources. When considering overall potential performance towards environmental, social, and economic objectives, additional trade-offs and co-benefits are also likely. To meet social equity objectives, outcomes will depend upon capabilities and available financial arrangements to make required investments and how policies and incentives are targeted. So in summary, why analysis of synergies, necessary conditions, co-benefits, and trade-offs, it helps us to better understand the potential of mitigation measures and their multiple and complex impacts. It also helps to provide and identify the extra efforts and coordination required to minimize inevitable trade-offs and avoid potential pitfalls. Finally, a landscape approach helps us to structure a complex analysis whereby CSA policy, investments, and changes have understandable effects on environmental, social, and economic goals. Next, we examine different options to advance strategic plans. Different approaches can be used in diagnosing conditions and identifying priorities. We briefly review three of them. One, via performance indicators. Second, participatory approaches. Third is quantitative modeling with computer models. Each has its pluses and minuses. First, we present an approach used by colleagues in the ASB consortium to examine different land uses and their effects on the landscape. Here's an example of the Peruvian Amazon, which shows the relationship between land uses and different evaluation criteria. Users define the units of analysis and the different criteria, whereas scientists devised the metrics and conducted measurements to fill the different cells. Here, carbon measures are above ground estimates, and biodiversity can be measured in different ways. This is an index based on the number of plant species. You can see that carbon storage ranges from high levels in forests to low levels in pastures, and biodiversity also has different levels per different land use. Regarding soil health, measures were proxies for agronomic sustainability. Bulk density corresponds to soil porosity and capability of water percolation. Other criteria such as phosphorus help to describe performance and sustainability of agronomic systems. Returns to land is a measure of the contribution of land uses to a regional or national economy. Employment estimates provide information on the effect of specific land use activities being promoted or restricted. And one can use a smallholder perspective using different discount rates to see how attractive different land use options are. This summary table enables policymakers and local citizens to identify the pluses and minuses of different land use options for strategic planning purposes. Another approach is to emphasize widespread participation in the policymaking and planning process. Many efforts over the years have experimented with community diagnosis and planning. Discussions are usually conducted in small groups with results brought together and presented and debated within the larger community. Interaction between citizens and policymakers can generate new insights and improve community ownership over policy development and implementation processes. A variety of different computer models are also available to use in planning. The benefit of computer models is to examine different interactions between people, the economy, and the environment based on a different sets of parameters, often requiring detailed data collection. And here are a variety of different options available on the internet, which have different approaches to assessing landscape performance. These models require careful calibration using historical data to recreate situations of the present, and from there they can extrapolate scenarios into the future with different assumptions under policy, technology, and trade. Now we can contrast these different approaches to planning by examining how many participants can partake in the planning process and how complex and detailed the analyses are. Traditional planning processes are very centralized budgetary efforts where complexity is not very high and very few people participate. The first example of the process of planning that we presented with the matrix is an example of qualitative analysis using indicators, which has a higher level of complexity and more participants than traditional methods of central budgetary planning. The participatory approaches can use roundtable discussions, focus group discussions, and participatory planning involving many different people. In contrast, computer models can use detailed data and computer models to examine interactions between objectives in achieving CSA. The benefit of these different approaches with participation, ownership can increase. However, the time and cost of advancing these processes can be quite lengthy. In contrast with computer models, very few people typically participate. Again, the process can be lengthy and decisions take quite a while to achieve. But these are some of the options available. One alternative is to advance these different approaches of planning over a period of time, involving different stakeholders in the process, and where necessary, apply different models to come up with more accurate estimates of the impacts of different CSA initiatives. So in summary, a landscape approach helps CSA to stimulate multiple ways of seeing contexts and potentials. Many synergies, co-benefits, necessary conditions, and trade-offs are likely. And strategic planning is a way to prepare and coordinate actions. Planning for CSA also emphasizes participation and can advance complex analyses. Participation can spur local knowledge and ownership in the process, whereas modeling produces deeper and perhaps new insights and knowledge. But both come with a trade-off requiring more time and money investments. Modeling is helpful to estimate and justify fair payment mechanisms if that is chosen as a method for CSA within a landscape. In sum, no one approach is best for all contexts, and it depends upon decision makers and the community to decide which avenue is the best to take for their own landscapes. Thank you for your attention. Sorry for the technical difficulties, and I look forward to the questions or your responses to the questions that we have right now. We have a series of questions here. First one is which perspective of landscape is most commonly used in your work and that of colleagues? Is it one of markets or agriculture, forestry, and cultural traditions, or policies and natural resources? Okay, responses to the first question looks like both agricultural and markets are the most popular and common perspective when considering landscapes. Let's go to the second question. What do you see as being the most essential in achieving climate-smart agriculture? Capacity building, agricultural credit linked with environmental performance measures, price premium for CSA-related products, payments for environmental services focusing on carbon, or payments for environmental services focusing on water provision. Interesting responses we're receiving here. Most see environmental services on carbon as being the most important. Nevertheless, capacity building and credit and price premium are seen as most essential in achieving climate smart agriculture. Let's go to the third question. Now, instead of the third question, it looks like we're opening the floor to questions directly from participants listening to the presentation. So if you have any question, please ask via the chat window. We have a question back at me though. what do I see as the most essential approach in achieving CSA? I see all those options as being potentially very important, and it depends on local context which needs to be determined by the people involved. There's no one straight answer for this. It requires careful diagnosis and discussion amongst people participating in climate smart agriculture initiatives. Here's an interesting question from Justin. How important is the role of the private sector to create demand for produce from climate smart agriculture? This is Private sector has great potential in facilitating demand for products through marketing initiatives. Consumers are often interested in local produce, well-managed farms, um, socially conscious products from not only local markets but international markets. The private sector can promote the availability and importance of these different products through advertising campaigns and working with initiatives domestically and internationally. The concept of climate smart agriculture can become more popular not only within the international development sector but the the common public. Here's a question. Are examples of CSA where all products and produce from the landscape have viable markets, including payments for environmental services? That's an interesting question. By what you mean viable markets? Yes, sir. Oftentimes, these viable markets are start off as being local and regional, and then slowly become more international as the knowledge and benefits are known outside in the different region. Um, as for examples of CSA, they're very few at the moment. Some initiatives are promoting CSA type objectives, but it really is not known as climate smart agriculture since it's a relatively new concept. A follow-up question from Justin. Will we have a CSA code of conduct to engage with consumers on CSA? That is a very interesting question on certification processes and how to ensure compliance with different standards and grades and standards. Um, there have been quite a few initiatives working on that, even in developing countries. One obstacle to achieving standards is the cost of establishing standards and implementing the regulations in different areas. Nevertheless, policy initiatives can support those different application of standards and grades so that more farmers can participate in these markets that could produce higher prices. Here's a question from Martin. Most of the CSA practices are known since a long time. Why is CSA not taken off in your opinion? What have been the principal bottlenecks? I see one of the challenges of CSA is creating the incentives for better stewardship of land. As you said, there are many initiatives to do so. Land care is one example in Australia and in Asia, where farmers have taken a longer term view of managing their soils. Nevertheless, the general public doesn't know about the different options in land management and how they affect climate. This is part of one of the challenges of getting climate change as a major issue to be taken up by the political sphere and policymakers. So one would hope as these negotiations on climate change advance, the profile of agriculture will be increased.
Thank you very much, Dr. Douglas White, for this very interesting presentation. And I also wanted to thank all participants for their participation and questions. We hope to have a recording of the webinar posted on the E-Institute website within 48 hours of the presentation. So basically within 48 hours after today, maybe sooner. And there you will also find Dr. White's presentation and other resources. So we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. And again, please stay tuned on the E-Institute website. Click on webinars on the left-hand corner because we're constantly updating our site. Thank you once again.